On June 30th, 2018, at the Philadelphia shipyard, a ceremonial launch took place for the container ship Daniel K Inouye. This vessel was the first in a series of 5 ultra-modern ships of the Aloha class, built for the American shipping company Matson. These powerful giants can transport up to 3,620-foot containers. They were proclaimed the largest commercial vessels ever constructed in the United States, and became a source of pride for the Philadelphia shipyard that would produce them. All of this would be an incredibly impressive achievement, except for one glaring fact. On the other side of the Pacific Ocean, shipyards like Hanwha Ocean in South Korea are building vessels 5 times larger. And while the American shipyard managed to complete just 2 ships in that same time frame, their Korean competitors produced over 50 next-generation mega-carriers that now dominate global trade routes. And here's another detail. The American shipyard is no longer American. Its new owner became that very same South Korean company Hanwha Ocean, with which they were trying to compete just a year earlier. In the race for leadership in global ocean trade, complete and unconditional victory in one form or another was claimed by just 3 countries: Japan, China, and South Korea. What makes this situation particularly interesting is that from the standpoint of conventional logic, there are no objective reasons why these specific nations should have ended up among the winners. If you ask an average person how these 3 countries managed to achieve dominance in modern shipbuilding, they'll probably say something about cheap labor in countries like China. After all, ships belong to the category of the simplest types of industrial products to manufacture. Therefore, it would make sense to choose a location with the lowest labor costs for their production. Right? But in this case, that factor has virtually no significance. Labor costs represent only a small fraction of the total cost of building a ship. According to industry analysis conducted by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, ultra-large container ships built at a shipyard, like South Korea's Samsung Heavy Industries, typically sell for between $100 and $200 million, depending on specific technical characteristics. Of that final price, only about $10 million goes toward paying the workers who assemble these vessels. Moreover, the bulk of the work is performed using powerful automated equipment, and the technical specialists employed at these production facilities are paid quite respectable wages even by European and American standards. The real costs are almost entirely related to the price of mechanical components, the volume of steel consumed, and the time these vessels spend at the shipyard during construction. In many cases, such costs in China, Japan, and South Korea are actually higher than in other countries around the world. The shipyards of these 3 leading nations won not because they were cheaper. They won because they were objectively better. A logical question arises. If shipbuilding has such critically important significance, why don't other states even attempt to replicate the success of these 3 countries? Hold on. Before we dive into this research, I need to know something. Where are you joining from? And what time is it there right now? Country, city, local time, put it all in the comments below. I really want to see how global this is. Now, let's get into it. This story consists of 2 parts. The first is about how the shipbuilding titans of the past lost their dominant position, and the second part is about how new Asian upstarts appropriated this strategically important industry. At the heart of any success lies the ability to manage. Whether it's ship production or financial flows, when some lose control, others create new models where transparency and awareness become the main advantage. And in investments today, a similar shift is occurring. Instruments are emerging that make capital management accessible to everyone. The key to understanding this industry shift is recognizing that it mirrors broader patterns in how capital and strategic advantage flow in the modern world. Just as shipbuilding moved from west to east, understanding these patterns helps us see where future advantages will emerge. Let's trace this journey back to its origins. In the late 19th century, absolute leadership in shipbuilding belonged to a single country, Great Britain. The colonial empire of that time provided it with both the necessary resources and the most powerful motivation to create the largest naval and commercial fleet the world had yet known. Other European empires also gradually began to build up their capacities, as they too sought to ensure their presence on the world's oceans, especially in the context of preparing for World War I. After the conflict was resolved, Britain and the rest of the European powers continued to maintain dominant positions in shipbuilding. Trade and cargo transport across the Atlantic to North America was becoming an increasingly profitable enterprise, which served as a key stimulus for further growth in commercial shipbuilding. As for naval forces, they remained in a state of mutual suspicion and rivalry throughout the entire interwar period. The grievances spawned by World War I were never fully settled. Active preparation for continuation of the confrontation was underway. At the same time, countries attempted to negotiate limitations on the size of the largest ships in their fleets by signing the Washington and London naval treaties. These agreements established clear standards regarding the maximum weight of warships, as well as quotas on their numbers for each party. There was hope that such measures would prevent a ruinous arms race. However, as is easy to guess from today's vantage point, this strategy proved ineffective. One of the simplest loopholes in the treaties was the ability to build more ships of smaller sizes that didn't fall under the established restrictions. But with the outbreak of World War II, all of this no longer mattered much. Over the next 5 years, a single country would dominate world shipbuilding: the United States. Between 1941 and 1945, American industry built 6 times more ships than all other countries on the planet combined. United States shipyards launched new vessels every single day. This armada was used to supply allies in Europe and conduct their own large-scale battles in the Pacific. However, such incredible productivity created a specific problem: a colossal oversupply. The fact is that most ships built during the war were not impressive battleships or aircraft carriers, but supply vessels whose task was to transport provisions across oceans and provide them to front lines. The American logistics system demonstrated such phenomenal power that specialized refrigerator ships producing ice cream were even dispatched to the Pacific Theater for troops fighting in tropical heat. According to legend, a Japanese general whose troops desperately needed provisions was astonished to discover that the Americans had resources enough even for such unprecedented luxury as ice cream ships. And it was at that moment he realized the war was essentially lost. In any case, after the war ended, America's shipbuilding industry virtually stopped instantly, although from an economic standpoint this shouldn't have happened. Certainly, maintaining a fleet of previous scale was no longer required. However, it was precisely during this period that international trade entered a phase of rapid growth. The Bretton Woods financial system established the pegging of world currencies to the dollar, which significantly simplified international settlements, since all major governments voluntarily agreed to such currency fixing. Combined with post-war recovery of the global economy, this opened unprecedented opportunities for global trade. American shipping companies had a choice. They could acquire one of thousands of decommissioned Navy ships of the Liberty type, or order a new vessel whose cost would be tens of times higher. Not surprisingly, local shipyards didn't have that many clients. As a result, most of them simply ceased to exist. But on the other side of the Pacific Ocean, the situation developed according to a completely different scenario. To support its military efforts, Japan was forced to develop competencies that allowed creation of some of the most technologically advanced vessels in the world. After the war ended, American occupation actually stimulated further development of Japanese shipbuilding. The United States sought to contain the spread of communism in Asia and viewed Japan as a strategic outpost to achieve this goal. By encouraging growth of the shipbuilding industry, Americans not only acquired a reliable trading partner, but also created numerous jobs for the local population, which in turn reduced the risk of spreading radical ideas such as seizing the means of production. In 1950, Japanese shipbuilding enterprises received a new form of support during another military conflict, this time on the Korean Peninsula. United Nations forces, consisting mainly of American and European contingents, conducted military operations against North Korean and Chinese troops. Japan's close proximity to the front line made it an ideal base for repair and maintenance. Instead of sending combat and supply vessels halfway around the world for technical service, military command preferred to use nearby Japanese shipyards. The historical irony was that less than a decade before these events, those same shipyards had been fighting against these naval forces. But setting aside historical paradoxes, capital investment from international forces became a catalyst for change, launching a cycle of positive feedback for the Japanese shipbuilding industry. Notably, Japan, like China and South Korea, experiences a significant shortage of raw material resources, particularly iron ore, for producing steel used in shipbuilding. As Japanese shipbuilders honed their mastery in creating giant container ships, they also achieved reductions in global tariffs for maritime transport. This in turn facilitated import of necessary raw materials from countries like Australia and Brazil, which additionally reduced costs for building new vessels. By the 1970s, Japan was producing more ships than all other countries in the world combined. European manufacturers at this time reoriented toward building cruise liners. Britain completely shut down the industry, and the United States virtually stopped participating in this race. At this stage, it becomes obvious that the shipbuilding industry is closely linked with the military strategic interests of states. The United States realized this back in 1920 when it passed the Jones Act. This legislative act establishes that any vessel operating between American ports must be built in the United States, sail under the American flag, and be operated by American citizens. The original purpose of the law was to protect and stimulate national shipbuilding and maritime transport, which ensured creation of powerful potential in the country in case of war. Unfortunately, these well-intentioned ambitions didn't withstand collision with harsh practical economics. American shipbuilders had guaranteed customers in the form of the United States Navy and local transport companies, like that same Matson already mentioned, which relieved them of the necessity to compete with world shipyards. This protection led to them remaining small, narrowly specialized, and significantly less efficient compared to growing Asian conglomerates. However, it wasn't just cost that determined Japan's leadership in world shipbuilding. Their true secret weapon was the financial system. By that time, Japan had become a leader in world exports, supplying everything from televisions to Toyota cars around the globe. But when international partners paid for this export, they did so predominantly in their national currency. The American dollar may be the greatest monetary instrument, but its direct purchasing power in Japan was limited. Japanese export-oriented companies receiving payments in dollars were forced to convert them into national currency necessary for conducting operational activities within the country. This created a serious macroeconomic problem. Each act of converting dollars to yen exerted upward pressure on the exchange rate of Japanese currency. Such dynamics completely contradicted the conditions of the Bretton Woods system, which Japan adopted in 1952 and which established a fixed exchange rate at the level of 360 yen per United States dollar. Thus, to counteract the market activity of Japanese companies selling American dollars to buy Japanese yen, the Japanese government had to massively sell Japanese yen and buy up dollars. These actions led to the emergence of a paradoxical situation. Japan ended up with a surplus of American currency. Instead of passively investing in bonds to receive interest income, the Japanese government developed a more strategic approach by creating a system of state banks. One such bank was rather creatively named the Export-Import Bank of Japan. Its key mission was providing preferential lending to support corporate growth of strategic export companies. How did this work in practice? Let's say in the 1970s you were an international businessman and wanted to create your own shipping empire. For this you would need, well, several ships. You have to start somewhere. At European shipyards, they would immediately take full prepayment in cash even before construction begins. With insufficient personal funds, you could turn to a commercial bank, but it would request a significant down payment and proof of your solvency, even in case of project failure. However, when approaching Japanese shipyards, you would be offered help from the State Export-Import Bank. This bank used part of its dollar reserves, transferring them to your chosen private bank. These funds served as the down payment for the vessel, significantly lowering the barrier to entry into the business. To make the deal even more attractive, the Export-Import Bank of Japan would also offer guarantees of refund for vessels built in their country. If you pay for a vessel and then the shipbuilder closes the business without having delivered it to you, well, tough luck. Although the probability of shipyard bankruptcy is statistically small, the sums of transactions are so significant that most financial institutions require substantial reserve funds from the buyer or state guarantees for return of payments, precisely through such institutions as Japan's Export-Import Banks. In 1999, a merger occurred between the Export-Import Bank and the Overseas Economic Cooperation Fund, resulting in the formation of the Japan Bank for International Cooperation. Despite organizational changes, the mission remained the same. According to information on the official website, they continue to provide advance financing for shipbuilding projects as well as financial services for satellite systems, port infrastructure, rail transport, and nuclear power plants. In modern realities, such state support has become an industry standard, which significantly limits the circle of countries capable of competing in the market of expensive exports. For a country to be able to sell ships, it needs a state bank willing to take on insurance. And for a state bank to want to support the country, it needs impressive foreign currency reserves. But such reserves can only be accumulated in one case. The country must initially be a major exporter. If you add the mandatory conditions of ocean access, it turns out that the state must be not only politically stable, but also possess a developed industry capable of building its own fleet. Today, only 3 countries meet these criteria, and it's no surprise that they're all located next to each other. However, even this doesn't give a complete answer to the question. Germany, for example, formally also fits all these requirements. So why doesn't it have a giant shipbuilding industry? In reality, it does. Moreover, Germany earns amounts comparable to South Korea from shipbuilding. The difference is only that the Germans bet not on the entire ship, but on its most expensive parts. Companies like MAN Energy Solutions, MTU, and Caterpillar produce ship engines costing over $50 million apiece, and that's almost a quarter of total production value. A striking example is the German company Mecklenburger Metallguss. The plant specializes in just one element, producing ship propellers that are then installed on ultra-large vessels. All propellers installed at Asian shipyards ultimately trace back to Germany. At their core are approximately 110 tons of copper, aluminum, nickel, and magnesium. These metals are remelted into bronze, capable of withstanding both salt water and colossal loads throughout the vessel's entire service life. At current market prices, Such a set of raw materials costs about 1.2 million euros. But after engineers and high-precision machines transform it into a finished propeller, shipyards buy it at a price exceeding 3 million. This is more than a 100% markup, even accounting for labor costs and cargo delivery. Now let's compare this with the shipyards themselves. The scale of their production is astounding, but in essence they merely transform steel sheets into giant boxes designed to transport other boxes. According to financial data, about 80% of a container ship's cost goes to components. Another 10% is payment for shipyard workers' labor. As a result, the enterprises themselves are left with only 10% to cover expenses and generate profit. Profitability is minimal. However, this is both a weakness and simultaneously a strength. Because for a country to have its own shipbuilding industry, one more condition is needed: political will. The state must genuinely want this industry to exist. Shipyards, of course, strive to increase profitability, but it's precisely the harsh economics that makes entry into this business so difficult for new players. Industry consolidation gave these companies the ability to form order portfolios for a decade ahead and produce dozens of ships of one class. This sharply reduced design costs and provided them with an obvious advantage due to economies of scale. For all other market players, it's simply logical to buy from this big three. Yes, having a shipbuilding industry can be considered a strategic military asset, but Germany's example is telling. Its fleet is small and plays only a supporting role within NATO. They don't claim global power projection, like in the case of the United States. In addition, another point should be considered. Even if, in case of global conflict, access to Asian shipyards is closed, the need for commercial container ships won't disappear. They'll have to be built in any case. In the United States, strategic shipbuilding still persists. However, in reality, it has only one serious customer: the Department of Defense, recently rebranded as the Department of War. It's enough to look at that same Philadelphia shipyard, where small commercial vessels are slowly being built under the Jones Act, to understand where the real money is concentrated. One aircraft carrier of the Gerald R. Ford type costs the fleet approximately $13 billion. Moreover, by size, it's only slightly smaller than container ships of the CMA-CGM type, but it costs 65 times more. Furthermore, maintenance contracts for such ships themselves represent enormous value. There's virtually no competition here. Obviously, the United States Navy will never send an aircraft carrier to a Chinese dock for nuclear reactor repair. Over the past 5 years, the world's largest container ships were built at shipyards in China, Japan, and South Korea. Europe went a different route. They continue to build vessels, but in smaller volumes and with an emphasis on quality. They have their own naval forces, as well as a market for high-tech vessels, for example, submarines. In parallel, companies like Lürsen, Abeking and Rasmussen, Benetti, and Feedship operate, producing super yachts where price plays a secondary role. For instance, the yacht Kourou, commissioned by Jeff Bezos during his midlife crisis, was built by Oceanco in the Netherlands. With a length of only 127 meters, less than half the size of new mega container ships, it cost twice as much. All because it's a high-tech custom project that someone with more money than sense will pay for. In terms of production volume, the 3 Asian shipbuilding centers so dominate the global market that all other players are barely noticeable in statistics. However, the real value of the industry lies in the fact that it's a joint and extremely interdependent process. Asian shipyards work in the mass production segment, large sales volumes with minimal margins. This is a kind of McDonald's of shipbuilding. The business is successful, but with completely different logic than the haute cuisine niche where other countries have established themselves. And as with McDonald's, the long-term prospects for these giants aren't the most rosy. Here's what this entire story reveals. 3 clear conclusions emerge. First, industrial dominance isn't about cheap labor anymore. It's about financial architecture. Japan, South Korea, and China didn't win because workers were paid less. They won because their governments created sophisticated financial systems, state-backed export credit agencies, currency reserve management, and strategic industrial policy that made it nearly impossible for competitors to match their terms. When you can offer a shipyard customer not just a vessel, but also the financing, insurance, and guarantees to make the purchase possible, you're not selling ships anymore. You're selling an entire ecosystem. Second, protectionism without competitiveness creates stagnation. The Jones Act was supposed to protect American shipbuilding. Instead, it created a captive market that removed any incentive to innovate or compete globally. American shipyards became small, slow, and expensive, surviving only on military contracts where cost is secondary to security. Meanwhile, the rest of the world moved on. This pattern repeats across industries. Protection without competition breeds inefficiency. The uncomfortable truth is that sometimes the best way to kill an industry is to shield it from the market. Third, strategic industries require strategic will. Germany makes more money from ship components than from whole ships because they made a choice. Focus on high-margin, high-tech parts where engineering excellence matters more than scale. The United States maintains a shipbuilding industry solely for military purposes because national security demands it, regardless of economics. China, Japan, and South Korea dominate commercial shipbuilding because their governments decided this industry was worth subsidizing, financing, and supporting for decades. The lesson here is simple. If you want a strategic industry, you have to want it enough to pay for it, and you have to be smart about how you compete. Here's the warning. The same dynamics playing out in shipbuilding are happening right now in semiconductors, batteries, solar panels, and artificial intelligence. The countries that combine state financial support, industrial policy, massive scale, and long-term strategic thinking are pulling ahead. The United States currently has a national debt exceeding $38 trillion as of 2025. That debt finances consumption more than strategic investment. Meanwhile, competitor nations are using their financial systems not just to build ships, but to build the industries of the future. The pattern is clear. Industrial leadership flows to those who understand that modern competition isn't just about free markets. It's about financial architecture, state capacity, and the will to play a long game. The real question for American policymakers isn't why only 3 countries build ships. It's whether the United States is willing to do what it takes to compete in the industries that will define the 21st century. Because if the lesson from shipbuilding teaches us anything, it's that once you lose industrial capacity, getting it back is nearly impossible. The infrastructure disappears, the expertise retires, the supply chains relocate, and suddenly you're dependent on competitors for things you used to make yourself. In shipbuilding, that ship has already sailed. The question is, what other industries are we willing to let go? Thanks for watching till the end. If you're here, you're one of those who want to understand how the financial system really works. Subscribe, new research tomorrow. And drop a comment. What do you think about this? Your perspective matters.